Earlier this month, the awesome folks at DFS Lab had a hackathon, and here to tell us all about it is Jake Kendall. Jake?
Hi. Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks for the intro. So we are going to tell you all about the hackathon and a little bit about DFS Lab and everything that we do. And we're going to try to give you a sense of what we learned at this hackathon, because the most important thing is kind of sharing back to the community what we learned. Lewis is actually going to jump in first and explain kind of the technical setup we had. He did a great sandbox and set of tools for all the companies to use. So I want to give him a few minutes to talk about that. Do you want to jump in, Lewis?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jake, for letting me steal 5 minutes of your presentation. Yeah, so just briefly, we saw this as an opportunity for us to get our, feet into gear, get into gear around deploying an open source sandbox environment. And it's been something we've been talking about for a little while now. And we've got the approval to keep this sandbox running, not only for the hackathon, but also kind of onwards into the future. And it's actually publicly available now. So yeah, just to share a little bit about the technical setup that we had and how it all worked. What it is a vanilla Mojo Loop deployment based on just your normal plain old Helm charts. So when you do the Helm install Mojo Loop, this is basically what we did with a few other bits and pieces, including an API gateway. We exposed a couple different APIs. It's all public. Nothing there is precious or can't be reset with a few minutes of work. We created this thing. I'm calling it the dev portal, but I'm open to better names. So check that out here at beta.mojolab.live. And this was kind of a central entry point for the participants of the hackathon to come and learn about Mojo Loop, and specifically learn about this environment of Mojo Loop that we deployed, and use guides that we'd written, and be able to copy and paste commands, curl commands, and the like to get up and running with Mojo Loop. So this is the dev portal. It deploys alongside of Mojo Loop, and we're going to make it so it's easy to deploy and easy to configure. And what we have on the right here is a kind of a little diagram of what the sandbox looked like. So you have a common sandbox, and we had a bunch of simulated DFSPs, all using vegetable names apart from egg mobile money, and that's because the mobile, it needed to be a shorter name, and I couldn't think of a 3-letter fruit starting with an E or a vegetable starting with an E. So anyway, that's not that important. That's kind of what we had. This is a couple screenshots just stepping through what the participants could look at and play around with. We had the APIs hosted there, some documentation around different test users, and some guides. This was super quick and nasty, and a shout out to the Motorsports guys for your help as well, getting stuff up and running. We kind of had a bit of their environment running as well, and we could link some of the participants through to some of the other missing pieces, which I've listed here, namely the UI stuff, making things look pretty, making things engaging, especially for more business-focused people. Also, we're missing some of the security components. Some of them we decided not to deploy because we know that we wanted the participants to get up and running nice and quick. But it's also got kind of going forward, that's the target that we have with this environment, making sure that we can actually prove to people that Mojo Loop is secure, and stepping them through the process of how to onboard and ensure that security. The third-party APIs, we had to kind of do a few workarounds to get them working because they're still in, excuse me, still in beta. And guides, and more guides. We found that guides were a really helpful way to help the participants get up and running, because they were asking specific questions about certain use cases they wanted to test out, or certain ways they wanted to interact with the sandbox. And we could just copy and paste a link. Hey, go and look at this guide, step through that and come back with some more questions, or if you need any more help. So yeah, one of the awesome things I think is going to be shared shortly is around the infrastructure as code contributions that's been made to the open source, and we're going to integrate that into this environment, or maybe even kind of semi-replace a lot of this and get it going, which will have a few more of these security and other features that I mentioned. Quickly, just how did it get used? Just some really rough stats that I managed to glean from looking around the databases. A bunch of different main API calls that we see in Moduloop kind of went on. This is over the course of, I think, kind of 3 days, but really only maybe a day and a half of hacking around with the environment. And we also opened up the APIs to let people register their own DFSPs just to see if they would. And nine people did. Maybe they did duplicates or something. But yeah, that's kind of a really quick rundown of what the environment was. We're really excited to keep it running for you guys and keep it as a resource for the community going into the future. So Jake, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. And just generally, thanks for putting that together. Came together a little bit last minute, but came together very well. People were very, very happy with it. So, so just to, I know there's a lot of people here who maybe don't know who we are and maybe don't know the context for this bootcamp hackathon. I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of an overview at this point. So DFS Lab, we're an early stage investor. We invest in companies that are building the digital economy in Africa, and do both cash investment, but we also invest a lot of time and support in kind, in person. So we call ourselves an accelerator on that basis, I guess. And our mission is really to work with the most exciting companies building kind of the digital commerce future in Africa. And this is our team. It's me, Stephen, Alina, Sarman, and Joseph. I think Joseph, maybe you all may have seen more of than the rest of the team, but he and Sarman are both based in Lagos. I'm in Paris. Stephen's in a lot of places, somewhere between China, Minsk, and San Francisco, and some of the places we've worked. So, so in addition to our work as an accelerator, an investor, and supporting a startup portfolio that we're working with, we have a couple of other activities, and we started doing these hackathons or what we call boot camps with our own portfolio a long time back, actually, quite a few years ago. Well, 3 or 4 years ago. And the idea is, we bring the companies together, and they go through a process where they can create a prototype, turn it into something that they can put in front of customers and get feedback really rapidly. And it's a great kind of way to instill kind of a lean, agile philosophy, and to teach that sort of like, how do you experiment and test before you build kind of approach. And the design aspect of the design sprint comes initially from Google's internal design team, but we've adapted it and changed it many, many times, so it might not be that recognizable even at this point. But our approach initially, and the one that we've used with our portfolio, is focused on sort of identifying a problem, building a prototype that addresses that problem, and testing it with users. And we've adapted it here so that, of course, it incorporates Moduloop. And the goal is to give people at least a little bit of upfront, push in the direction of design thinking and thinking through what they're actually building first, and then let them run in Lewis's great sort of digital playground sandbox, where they can build a prototype and have it work with the live Moduloop instance and show how that all works. So we think it's a nice kind of combination, because it really forces them to think through what they're doing and then build it and show it working in the back end technically. Big picture, why do we do this? So 2 main reasons. One is education and awareness, right? So the startup and developer and sort of technology company ecosystem is not one that's that engaged around Moduloop initially, is sort of, or sort of naturally. I think banks and telcos and maybe government regulators are kind of the more natural audience. And so we're trying to reach that audience with, something that kind of compels them to come learn about it and hopefully have a positive experience and go away and tell other people and influence the broader ecosystem. And the idea there is just, the more people out there who know about it, think it's great and want it to happen, the more likely that is the case. And then of course, probably the more important aspect is to test and validate commercial use cases and to create sort of real feedback of, here are sort of edge users, what would be edge users of a Moduloop system, ones that would come in through probably a bank or a mobile operator initially, or a PISP, to create some sort of transactional flow or whatever it is. And so can we sort of observe how they want to use it and make sure that Moduloop kind of meets those needs well, and sort of feed that back into your work as a community in developing Moduloop as a product or as a platform. Our process, I explained a little bit. We have this design process. This is, of course, these photos are not us being completely irresponsible and having an in-person event with no masks, but this is actually one that happened before COVID, and we did in person. And spend the first part of the day, as I explained, kind of, of course, first we do a kind of deep dive on Moduloop, and then we do a design sprint for sort of a day or a little bit more to get clear on the problem and design what the prototype and the flow and the user experience should look like. And they'll create kind of a UI, UX storyboard and process map. And then the next day and a half or so are really to build it and turn it into a live demo, which is pretty cool. And there's Lewis again. So the idea is, again, 0 to Moduloop in like 3 days. And just, real quick hit examples. Tanda, which is one of the companies, demoed kind of withdrawal from a DFSP via one of their agent network. They're a Kenyan third-party agent network company, and they do cash in, cash out, and a bunch of other things. Tolino wanted to do cross-border remittances application. Pompii, which we'll get into in a second, wanted to enable payments via a link sent through WhatsApp, kind of increasingly active area. So that just gives you a flavor. Here's the sort of a complete list of the companies who came, and you can see it's a wide variety. You may not recognize them all, but many of them are well known in the sort of fintech and digital economy ecosystem. And of course, our the obligatory team screenshot. This is one of the sessions we had. We had about 50 participants, depending on the day. And we use actually Discord, and not to sort of plug Discord because I don't own stock or anything, but it worked quite well as a group sort of platform for this kind of thing. It's a messaging platform. It's actually built for gamers, but it allows you to kind of do presentations, chat rooms, voice and video chat rooms, texting, and a whole bunch of other stuff, kind of all simultaneously. So that actually worked quite well. So if any of you all are doing a similar digital virtual event, we can recommend it. So I'm going to go into not every single company, but as many as I can kind of have time for. And feel free to ask questions. I left time in here for questions and discussion. So if nobody asks any questions or anything, we'll probably end a little bit early. But I'm happy to sort of get into it a little bit and not just talk at you. Joseph and Lewis are here also, so you guys feel free to jump in and answer anything that people ask, as well as Dan, I believe. So OnePipe is a Nigerian fintech. They are essentially an API marketplace is one way to think about them. They are integrating all the banks on one side of the marketplace and the APIs that the banks are offering, and then kind of trying to create a single, easy to use, well-maintained, smooth API for developers, fintechs, and others on the other side of the marketplace. And so essentially they're taking banks services and reselling them in a much nicer, easier to use form, and one that's more well maintained and kind of a common API. So it's a great product. They've full disclosure, we're investors in them, and they've been kind of one of the hot companies in Nigeria over the past year or so, and they've grown quite a bit, looking at international expansion. But on some level, a potential Mojaloop themselves, because they do kind of integrate all the banks and kind of a lot of the different payment processors and folks like that, and sit at the center of all that. And their Mojaloop use case was, how do we enable customers to use whatever account they want to pay at a sort of an online merchant purchase scenario, sort of checkout scenario. And what they created was, they actually had a nice demo, and I couldn't figure out how to sort of de-risk switching back and forth between a bunch of live demos, because I had wanted to do that. But basically, they created a web application with a shopping cart. You go in, you buy a few items, you click to check out, and then basically you just have to enter your phone number, which does the lookup on the back end. You can see their transactional flow here, and then creates a payment flow for the user to pay with a one-time password that they get from their financial institution. So pretty nice use case. One of the things they really wanted and would have really liked is if they just had to put in one phone number and get all of the person's payment enabled accounts, which I know is kind of on the future roadmap. But that was probably the biggest. We'll get into sort of some of the common themes. But that was probably the biggest request, I think, from across the different companies, was that notion of kind of a single UID for all of their financial, sort of accounts, that they could create a really nice user experience if you could just do that. One of the things that OnePipe really valued, I think, in terms of what's already working, is the fact that this person doesn't have to go in, put in a whole bunch of information, and sign up with the website. They can just sort of, as they would with a credit card, they can go in and just sort of pay without doing a whole bunch of user onboarding steps and things like that. So interesting use case there. And you can see the sequence diagram, by the way. All the companies did one of these sequence diagrams, and so we're documenting all this stuff, and we're gonna share it out with the entire community. So that'll be available hopefully in the next few weeks. We're right now, I should say, we're in process of creating that. So there may be a few questions I might not be able to answer on each of these, but will be coming soon. Tanda's another one. Pretty common theme in terms of both. The last boot camp, we had, I think, two variants of kind of the agent network, third-party cash in, cash out, and digital goods agent network. Tanda is in Kenya. They want to turn sort of your everyday neighborhood store into a one-stop shop for digital goods and financial services, including cash in, cash out from banks and other DFSPs. Their use case was Kiko, because they do actually more than that with the retailers that they work with. And they wanted to do Kiko with banks without having to do N bilateral integrations, where N is the number of banks, right? So great Mojaloop use case, and created a Kiko agent flow. Basically, would look a little bit like what the agent app would look like. And yeah, I think learnings from them were just again kind of reinforcing again, I think, how critical this sort of interoperable agent network use case is for Mojaloop. I mean, we had, like I said, many other kind of applicants using it, and or who applied to come to the bootcamp who had that sort of same use case. And we had a couple from last time. So it's definitely sort of a big area for in sort of, where there's obviously a lot of commercial value being created if we can get Mojaloop up and running. Pompii, very interesting company. They are they're actually a collaboration. They're a startup, but they're heavily funded by a syndicate of Chinese investors, and they have a sort of joint venture type partnership with Transsion, who's sort of one of the biggest mobile phone makers, and they have the option to come pre-installed on Transsion handsets across Africa, which they will. They've already started to do a little bit, and so they've got about 400,000 active users in Nigeria right now, and then are looking at a much bigger regional expansion. So very, very interesting. Going onto low-end phones even, and looking at sort of create their sort of core product offering is a payment app, so ability to pay friends P2P, but also bills, airtime, digital goods. And their modular use case was, how can we enable payment for a merchant to be sent as a link through WhatsApp? So they're looking pretty keenly at the emerging WhatsApp sort of commerce market, and created exactly that ability for a merchant to send a link, and used Lewis's TTK tool pretty effectively. I think for them as well, I mean, the sort of integration between phone number that could be pulled out of WhatsApp, ability to trigger a payment, that to your bank or to your MNO, kind of seamlessly within a chat experience. That was kind of the main thing they were going for. So pretty interesting use case. Just looking at see if there's any questions in my chat. I can't see the other chat thing, so you'd have to raise your hand, I think, if you want me to answer anything. So Tolino, they're based in the Philippines, and they're essentially a sort of a product shop. They build financial services products, mostly kind of targeting the Filipino diaspora. So of course, remittances are a big area, and they wanted to offer a directed remittance product. So the idea being, Filipino workers, in this case in Bahrain, but I guess they could potentially be based anywhere, want to send money home, but want to decide in advance what it's used for. And that's actually fairly complicated, if you can imagine. So there's both the cross-border element, but then there's also the, how do you hold the funds in kind of a pending account while the receiver may go in and decide, okay, now I want to pay my electricity bill. How much is it? Okay, I pay. Then the rest of the funds are held for anything else that's been pre-approved. So it could be, electricity, groceries. You can see the example over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the idea was, the person who sent it could say, well, I'll pre-approve groceries, electricity, and school tuition, right? And so then on the back end, they'd have to be able to sort of select for merchant categories, or individual merchants potentially, and then hold the funds until the person is ready to pay those bills. So it's a relatively complicated sort of use case and flow scenario. And illustrated, I think, another two areas that I think came up more than once and at relatively frequency. One is the cross-border. There's tons of interest, especially in Africa, but pretty much everywhere in sort of, cheaper, easier, more interoperable cross-border payments. Probably not surprisingly, I mean, that's a pain point just generally, but Africa in particular, I think there's just a ton of kind of cross-border commerce. It's 54 kind of relatively small economies. The other part was kind of this escrow element and just sort of, pending transactions and things like that are kind of related to different e-commerce scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but yeah, so pretty interesting one there. Finance Mobile, they are a reg tech or revenue tech company. They're trying to create government tax collection and government to person to government payment solutions in West Africa. And their goal is how to improve tax compliance while giving taxpayers a better experience. Their demo was a kind of a government tax collection and payment portal where users in this case are small businesses or businesses in general, would kind of be sharing in an automatic way from some of the other digital platforms they're on invoices from their, I think it was imports and exports, if I'm not mistaken. And the government would, the portal would then sort of tally and track from their invoices their total kind of tax bill at the end of the month. And then they could go in and trigger a payment based on the amount that they owed. And the idea was, they could put in sort of, again, this was yet another one that would have really liked a single sign-on kind of single user ID experience that could bring up all the different payment options. Because what they found is that a lot of these small businesses have multiple accounts, may change from month to month which one they want to pay from based on where they have liquidity or what line of business is doing better and whatnot. And so the ability to sort of say, in real time, pull up which accounts that person or that business has and trigger a payment based on the amount owed was something they valued a lot. So yet another kind of interesting use case. PayCloud was another interesting one. They're another category that we see a lot as investors, folks who are trying to essentially build what we call the sort of all-in-one digital commerce stack for SMEs. Usually there's a big, gold rush, if you want to call it like that, on to become kind of the commerce stack for SMEs in Africa, in multiple countries. And usually some of the components are, interoperability, ability to sort of accept payments from lots of different types of payment instruments. Sometimes it integrates with an ability to kind of like market yourself on different social media, WhatsApp, SMS, etc. Sometimes it integrates with kind of, resource management, value chain, stock management, that kind of stuff. Integrates with suppliers, that kind of thing. And then, of course, often integrates with kind of financing the business itself, and sometimes also delivery on the other end. So those are some of the big components that we see from various different companies like PayCloud, who are trying to kind of create these sort of comprehensive digital solutions for SMEs. And their Moduloop use case was just how to do kind of a QR payment on the front end with the user, showing up at a merchant's store. And of course, they liked the fact that the merchant and the customer wouldn't have to know each other in advance. They wouldn't have to sort of pre-register with each other or anything like that. They, I think, looked at a couple of other things. The fact that one thing that they were interested in was using kind of the metadata around Moduloop and the sort of transactional histories to do credit scoring. And that's a theme that comes up all the time. And we haven't really leaned into it within the bootcamp framework because, mostly because it's not really on the roadmap for Moduloop, at least from what I'm aware of in your roadmap. And so, haven't necessarily tried to deeply explore that one, but it does come up all the time. And I think that, there's a huge kind of commercial incentive to push things in that direction. And so thinking about it, from the perspective of it's probably inevitable as an outcome. And so, maybe planning for it and thinking about, how would something like that integrate, even if the Moduloop community doesn't necessarily need to take on, the need to build a credit scoring engine or sort of a plaid like, API that can, or a set of sort of data sharing protocols within the system necessarily. Thinking about how that should work and ways in which the system can be made to both facilitate it, but maybe facilitate it in a safer way. I mean, you can imagine, credit scoring and stuff isn't always have a great outcome. So That's a thought that's occurred to us a number of times. We've seen so many, companies sort of knock on that door and try to say, hey, what data can I get out of this that I can use for credit scoring? Tmapped. So Tmapped is another kind of agent network with also trying to do kind of a mobile money use case. They wanted, again, to explore sort of cross-border use case, so sort of peer-to-peer transactions and that kind of thing. But I think they were looking at sort of Ghana to Nigeria, which is their main sort of international border or sort of corridor that they'd like to explore. So for them, and for like, again, there's, again, the very big one that comes up all the time is like, how do we do seamlessly, moving money across Africa, not just within borders. So, So those were some of the ones I just wanted to highlight. There was a couple of other ones. They'll all be kind of included in the final report. But maybe I'll pause there and just see there was questions or anything else from anyone out there. And actually, I don't know if I would even be able to see you raising your hand or anything like that. So send me in if I'm missing anything, let me know.
No, just I think go ahead. But if anybody has a question, they can raise their hands. I'll jump in and let you know, Jake. Okay,
good. So, as I said, I wanted to kind of try and summarize some of the things. This is a little bit preliminary because, as I said, we're still in the process of, kind of distilling down what we learned and documenting it well and that kind of thing. So, this is maybe call this preliminary kind of impressions. But these were some of the things that came up most often that we saw across the different teams. And these come mostly from the bootcamp itself, the hackathon, but also just from talking to a lot of, sort of digital economy, e-commerce companies, et cetera, fintechs, et cetera, in Africa. So the first question that everyone asks is, this is really cool, this is awesome, where is it live? So, just to know, I mean, I think the more we as a community can publicize, where it's live, where it's going to be live, it just changes people's psychology immensely as to whether this is something that's worth participating in. As most of you probably know, folks in the private sector, but especially startups and technology companies, they have to move at such a rapid pace. They have sort of the exigencies of survivor or, sort of scale or perish. They really can't spend a lot of time thinking about stuff or contributing to an open source community until it's, going to become a reality somewhere. And I think that sometimes we don't publicize as much as we should, sort of the wins in terms of, so-and-so is going to launch it or has, started down the pathway to launching it or open an inquiry into it. I wish there was more of that that's being publicized. So just as a, just kind of to reinforce that, I do think that we would help the community a lot to sort of, publicize more sort of where there is activity and what the progress is. The biggest one, again, was how do we give the users the option to transact with from any of their accounts using one ID? And I know that that's on the roadmap, but, was just something that a lot of the companies asked about. And it's mostly because, with these companies, these are, as I said, these are sort of the edge users of Mojaloop, right? They're the ones who are building stuff that's going to be often in the user experience, the direct user experience. This ability to allow a user to put in a one number that they know by heart, their phone number, and not have to go look up a bank account. I mean, I have to do this sometimes, and I hate having to go look up my bank account number, but I'm not going to memorize it. I mean, nobody's going to do that, right? So the ability to just go by memory, enter a number, and have all of their payment options, at least all the ones that they've registered within Mojaloop, pop up and say, hey, I want this one. I'm going to pay with my XYZ bank, Banana Bank or Apple Bank or what have you. That's a super huge thing. Next one, cross-border, as I said, there's a huge amount of friction there. I know that's a long ways out, sort of on the Mojaloop roadmap, but just keep in mind, that is a really important one for a lot of commercial actors. can we access the data for credit scoring? As I went into that a second ago, but I do think, obvious, that's another one. There's an obvious kind of big commercial incentive, a lot of value that could come out of that. And thinking that through and looking at some, there are a number of kind of large tech companies globally who do this, Plaid, of course, and others. There's actually some in Africa as well, and I know it's not really what Mojaloop is about. In fact, I think there's some debate over whether that would be a good thing even at all, but it's certainly, just kind of reinforce the fact that it's very much kind of a center of commercial attention and always will be, I think. Escrow function, how do we, there's a lot of e-commerce use cases that where escrow is kind of almost inherent, and it often is done in current models by the platform itself. So thinking about whether Mojaloop wants to think about an escrow model, stuff like, delivery, I ordered delivery, but it hasn't arrived yet. Different kinds of online transactions where goods or services or other things have to be exchanged, online gig work platforms, things like that. There's a lot of use cases where that's important. Whoops. Another one that came up I thought was interesting. It didn't come up tons of times, but it came up once or twice, and I think it fits to me into this sort of like, how do we serve kind of the e-commerce, m-commerce, kind of just sort of online and digital commerce, the drive to have really kind of tight, nice user experiences. Is how do you manage out-of-band messages with the banks? I think a lot of these companies are used to maybe cards or other kind of payment experiences where you don't necessarily have these out-of-band messages that maybe sort of SMS and other OTP and other things like that. And just sort of making sure that stuff, if possible, can be fit into the user experience that the digital, platform is trying to build, whether it's like I said, a website checkout or a mobile commerce or what have you. And it reminded me of the Verified by Visa program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where you kind of go in, you click on the buy, and that kind of, they've done a decent job anyway of making that ability to pop that up within the e-commerce flow, rather than taking you to some other website, which was originally how that used to work. It's actually one of the first companies I worked at was the one that created the Verified by Visa thing. So anyway, just thinking in those terms, like how can we manage that so it's more synchronized, more standardized, more sort of, potentially able to sort of keep it within the flow of the user experience, even if it, even has to be standardized. So that kind of thing would be interesting thought process. The second to last question here, it's a complex API with callbacks and such, is a simpler version. That was, there was variance on that. That question was about the callbacks, some asynchronicity of the API. Some just sort of found it complicated in ways that they weren't maybe very articulate in explaining. We try to document that stuff as well as we can, but I do think there's our boot camps are a place where pretty, very, very experienced, top-notch developers come, and pretty inexperienced, folks who don't have a lot of sort of deep technical skill. And I think a lot of the folks around this table have that deep technical skill. So just thinking in terms of when this meets, when the rubber meets the road and this really gets out into the wild, really streamlining the documentation and the APIs themselves to be a little bit more manageable. It may not be the priority right this second, but I do think it's important. That was just something that came back from a number of different interactions we had. And then that's related to that. I think both of these bottom two are probably both of the same question, just like how do we do, some of the more difficult stuff within the protocol. So again, any questions, let me know. Questions for the future, I think, based on sort of some of those observations, I'm just sort of looking at the chat to see if any of it's addressed at me. So, you let me know, right? like I said, how do we, DFS Lab, or maybe the wider community, how do we help get the word out about modular loop deployments? I really think that's critical, because it's literally like, no person that we talk to about modular loop didn't ask that in like the first 10 minutes, you know what I mean? So I think it's just a really critical element of communications. How do we target some of the e-commerce and sort of digital commerce use cases that I mentioned? So escrow, single sign-on UID, out-of-channel messages, just sort of keeping that sort of need for a really smooth, easy to integrate, cross-platform, multi-channel, something that can go into a text message as much as it can go onto a mobile app or a website. Keeping that in mind, I think, just in generally is almost a philosophy. I know that, that may not be something, if you're saying, how do we build something for the poor, which is obviously the kind of core motivating philosophy of modular loop. But I've always thought that if a modular loop system becomes the sort of, well, that's the system for low income people, all the rest of us are over here building something else, because, for example, it doesn't meet sort of e-commerce and other sort of, higher income, if you want to call them that, use cases. I think that's a real shame, right? I think modular loop has the potential to add a huge amount to all the digital economy use cases, not just ones that involve the poor. But if it's not used, across sort of the spectrum, it just, that much harder to get scale, to get wide adoption, to get all the things that are going to be needed to really see it bloom and grow. So that's my piece on that. Is cross-currency support coming? Like I said, increasingly requested in the hackathon. And then, getting back to sort of the difficulty a few people had in using it, sort of like, can we as DFS Lab be more helpful in using our events to create more of a style guide, a contributor guide, improve documentation, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I know that there's a lot of work going on that angle already, but I guess, maybe we just want to make sure that we're as helpful as we can on that kind of thing. So that is what I had left. Looks like we've got about 10 minutes left, maybe a little bit more. Happy to answer questions, or we can let you go early if that's what everyone wants to do.
Thanks, Jake. There is some conversation in the chat there, and I think there was a question from Jill. Jill, perhaps I can get you to vocalize your question. Jill, are you there? You might want to unmute first.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't realize you unmuted me. Hi, Jake. I think, well, first, I really liked that you talked about how this really shouldn't be just for low income. I think that's really important to remind everyone about, because it has to be relevant for the broader economy and broader consumer base. But my other question, I think you're referring to, Leslie had actually given a brief response about, it had been about like local context and the local environment. So some of the questions that you had put on the slide that had come from your participants were about cross-border and data analysis. And to me, data analysis is also about like data localization.
Yeah, I think
those issues, I think of the regulatory environment, and if they're even, I guess you could say, quote unquote, allowed or permissible. And so I was kind of curious to hear, how you think, is modular loop going to be harder to deploy in environments that don't have those things permissible, or do you see modular loop as being something that might facilitate the regulator?
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot to that, and let me see. That's a very good, very good question, and a very good area to dive in. So, I think that one model is kind of the open API model. sort of in the UK, or initially in the UK, and then another one is maybe Plaid from the US, which is more just sort of organic private sector model, right? Both pretty similar in the sense that what happens is a person comes onto a third-party app. That third-party app says, "Can we connect to your bank account and maybe see some of your data or what have you?" And by sort of showing permission from the user, that third-party app gets access to that data, right? I mean, just really roughly speaking, I'm actually not, I'm not an expert actually in sort of open APIs, but I'm sure there are people on here who know it much, much more deeply than I do. But then, that's sort of the basics of it. And, I don't know what the regulatory landscape is in really fine-grained detail across Africa on that particular sort of use case, but I know there's a bunch of companies doing it, mostly kind of following not so much the open APIs, which is a standardized way to do that, but more the sort of organic thing where they, sort of not hack into banks in an illegal way, but create sort of screen scraping initially and then potentially through APIs and things like that. So that stuff's out there. I think what people get excited about here is the notion that you could potentially have a one integration one point of integration hub for doing that, rather than having 3 or 4 companies have to go around bilaterally kind of integrating or screen scraping even everybody, and then, taking what they can from that experience, from that sort of, building that themselves. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, and it's not just for credit, actually. There's a whole bunch of use cases, being able to see how much balance someone has so that you can make a payment that's not going to, or make a withdrawal that's not going to sort of, trigger their over the, what do you call that, when basically over debit their account so that they have to pay a fee and that kind of thing. I mean, there's a whole bunch of use cases for the access to data in that format. Often the first credit, the credit thing is kind of where people start, but so anyway, there's a bunch of reasons why that'd be useful. So I definitely think, but yeah, obviously it would have to be done in accordance with local regulations and things like that. My sense is most countries outside the EU are playing a little bit of catch up on those kinds of things, and so it's a little bit Wild West. But I couldn't give you kind of a solid, well-researched regulatory landscape across Africa. I'm sure that I'm unaware of certain things happening for sure.
Jill, are you satisfied with the answer?
No, that was great. I just kind of wanted to, hear some of the thoughts, and I completely understand. Yes, this is, not a environment to give a, full, well-researched, presentation on the different kinds of regulatory environments. I just know that I have personally my own work and analysis seen some data localization policies kind of on the rise, especially in East Africa. And I know that is affecting the fintech community, and they are, looking at them, should we say, and that can have an effect for sure on business models, especially the ability to, do the kind of analytics that we've been talking about today. So yeah, it was good to hear from you. And I just, thought I'd put that kind of question or thought out there.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. I just noticed a little bit of the chatter on kind of the documentation and things. One of the things I was going to mention is I think, we certainly got feedback that the documentation was much better than last time, which was about 18 months ago, I want to say. So, it's obviously been a lot of progress. One aspect of what we do, I think that maybe it reveals some need, is that we have sort of both technical and non-technical people kind of going through this. Something, like I said, some people who are kind of technical on that spectrum. And so I think from a technical perspective, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but my sense was the reasonable level of documentation. But it would have been nice. A few people told me to have real use case, like commercial use cases, kind of documented with code samples and things like that, and maybe even explained in kind of the commercial context, or you want to pay someone or whatever. So that was just a thought based on, I know there was some back and forth on the documentation stuff. Any other questions quickly before we jump off? I think we're still on track, unless we're out of time. You tell me.
No, we're still on track. I don't see any hands, so I think I could take back 6 minutes from time, Jake. And I'll point people to the discourse link that's just been posted in the chat. If you want to follow up on any conversations or questions, please share them there. Thank you so much, Jake.
Thank you all, and thanks, Simeon, and thanks to everybody who made this possibility. I think both my team, Lewis, all the support we got from the Mojaloop folks was really great. And reach out. We're happy to happy to connect with people if you have questions or thoughts or what have you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jake.